Okay, so we've got Andrea, who's from San Francisco, California, who joined the call because she's an RG chapter leader and works in an independent school and attended private school and graduate school. Carl from Cleveland, Ohio, who's a teacher in a boys' private school where the Kavanaugh hearings had some disheartening responses. Harshita, who was born and raised in Mumbai High School in San Francisco Bay Area, currently attending Harvard, joined to share my money story and how I make sense of being a queer woman of color and an immigrant with class privilege and future access to wealth. Daphne and Dave from DC joined to learn more about the role of institutions we're implicitly involved in with play a role in upholding patriarchy. Awesome. And folks can keep reading from other folks and throwing stuff in here. We have a college counselor at an affluent private school, would like to learn more techniques for engaging in conversation. Other folks who went to private school. Awesome. We're really excited to have this group together today. So I'm going to kick us off with some introductions from our speakers this evening. So Adam Howard, wondering if you can start us off by telling us a little bit about who you are, and then from your vantage point, what stood out to you about the Kavanaugh hearing and Dr. Ford's testimony?
Yeah. So hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Adam. I am a professor and chair of education at Colby College, and the focus of my research is about elite schools, and specifically the identity development of elite adolescents and young adults. If I've been researching elite schools for about 23 years, I was trying to calculate, which seems incredible on a number of fronts. Part of it is when I decided to become a teacher many, many years ago, I never thought that I would kind of focus my career and almost all of my teaching in elite schools. I grew up in a very small town in Appalachia. And for those folks who aren't familiar with Appalachia region, it's one of the poorest regions in the United States. And I grew up, like many people in my community, in a very poor family, in a non-working poor family, and didn't have a lot of educational opportunities during that time. But through the help of incredibly amazing mentor, it was a 7th grade English teacher who changed my life. I went to an undergrad institution called Berea College. And for those folks not familiar with Berea, it's a liberal arts college in Eastern Kentucky, and it's a school only for poor Appalachians. You actually have to be poor in order to be admitted there. It's one of the only schools in the country like that. And we don't pay tuition. I know a lot of people, that may sound kind of remarkable that you don't have tuition, but instead we work our way through school. So I spent the first about 23 years of my life mostly surrounded by peers who came from poverty also, and came from the same kind of poverty like me. And so my worldview and my experiences were really shaped by the relationships and life experiences. But to make an incredibly long story short, I went to graduate school at Harvard through their outreach program to recruit minority students. As an Appalachian, I'm considered a minority to Harvard. And unlike my undergrad institution, Harvard was certainly not a school for poor people, as I'm sure you know. And this was really the first experience I had being around peers who weren't from the same background as me. And I felt like what I've called in my writing and what other people have called as an outsider within this kind of institution. I was a part of I was a part of the community as a student, but at the same time, apart from everything that was really going on. I felt very isolated. It was a pretty difficult time for me. I feel very, it certainly has done amazing things for me, but it was certainly uh, uh, a difficult kind of experience in many ways. After I got my master's at Harvard, I started teaching at a elite school in a very affluent suburb of Cincinnati. And once again, I found myself in an incredibly unfamiliar context. I felt like I didn't know what was going on. And because it was so unfamiliar, I wasn't really able to be the teacher that I wanted to be. A teacher who was committed to issues of social justice and helping my students think critically about the world. I discovered that, my students and others' worldviews were so drastically different from my own, and that I needed to really understand their worlds much better than I did to be the kind of teacher that I wanted to be. So I started researching. I turned to research as a private school teacher in order to understand that world of elite schools and to understand the worlds of my students. And that led me to a focus on the culture of these types of schools, of elite schools, and the lessons that students learn from their education through these institutions, specifically the lessons that they learn about themselves, others, and the world around them. So through my study of elite schools over these years, one of the things that I've done is I've reconceptualized this concept of privilege to make it more useful for me and others to kind of think about how privilege works. There's a lot of work out there that tries to kind of break down how privilege works, and so part of what I've done is try to reconceptualize it. What I mean by that is that privilege has mostly been understood intrinsically as something individuals have or possess, specifically their advantages. That I have certain advantages because I'm a male, as a white male, and so forth, and others who are not white male do not have those same advantages. That's an important kind of to acknowledge those advantages, but I think privilege is much more than that, that it's something more intrinsic, as something that reveals who people are and who they will become in a fundamental sense. So I've reconceptualized privilege as an identity or an aspect of identity. And by that I mean it's a lens through which individuals with economic, social, and cultural advantages understand themselves, others, and the world around them. Their values, perspectives, assumptions, and actions are shaped, created, recreated, and maintained through this lens of privilege. So kind of one of the controversial parts of my research is that I don't focus a lot on what advantages that people have. I mean, but instead, I am more concerned with people's self-understandings that have those advantages. To think about privilege in this way is not to deny or diminish, though, the importance of advantages that certain individuals or groups have over others. It is, in fact, to underline or emphasize the relationship between advantages and identity formation. And therefore, understand the ways individuals actively construct and cultivate privilege. So I'm more focused on the agency of individuals, what they actually do with their advantages, instead of saying, oh, I have advantages and I can't really do anything about it. Well, actually you can. And so let's let's unpack that some. So, the hearings. There were several things. The Kavanaugh hearings. There were several things. To me, one of those things, though, was just how the workings of privilege were on such a public display during the testimony of Kavanaugh when he was making his case against the allegations of sexual assault. I mean, I found it quite remarkable, and remarkable in the sense that the workings of privilege are often hidden, and the sense of entitlement that he displayed is usually not on such public display. You know, and because of that, he didn't come across in a very positive way as someone who deserves the power that he has. He didn't project this image of kind of being deserving of that power or this goodness that plays an incredibly important part of preserving power. Leads use a variety of ideological strategies I have discovered through my research, such as legitimation, rationalization, deflection, unification, all of those kinds of different strategies, like I deserve my advantages because I work hard enough, for example. To project oneself as being good, in many ways elites are really, really, really good at being good, at least on the surface in public ways. So the Kavanaugh, hearings and how he behaved before the Senate, it was shocking to see that he wasn't maintaining that performance of goodness. For elites, identity is very connected to how they perform that identity, because you have to constantly kind of convince yourself and others that you are who you say you are. And this is where Kavanaugh's kind of strategies of always talking about how hard he worked and how successful he is was really overshadowed by the profound sense of entitlement that was revealed through his testimony. So there were a lot of things that kind of stood out for me, but one of the main things was just how things that aren't on public display about how power works and how privilege works was just on display, and it worked, and it led to what he wanted it to lead to, which makes me very, very nervous about the current times. Yeah.
Thanks, Adam. Great. So, Adam Roberts, can you tell us a bit about who you are, what brings you to this webinar, and then also what stood out to you about the Kavanaugh hearing and Ford testimony?
Yeah, hi everyone, can you hear me? Always got to do a Zoom test. Hi everyone, my name is Adam Roberts. I use he and pronouns. I am on resource generation staff and have been involved with the organizations for about 5 years, and now in a staff role support our Northeast and Midwest chapters. And I'm based in Boston, if any other Boston folks are around. And yeah, I think some bits about me like relevant for this call. So I share like basically all of the identities that Brett Kavanaugh does. So I am a cisgender man, I am white, I am owning class, and attended similar types of prep schools. So I'm from Newport, Rhode Island, and attended a private elementary middle school there and a prep school there, and then attended a Ivy League university. And I want to keep it relatively short because I'm going to get to share elsewhere, but a couple things. I just wanted to share, like, I'm nervous speaking on this call, and I think there were big parts of me, like instincts that were like, let me dodge like speaking as a white dude about this topic or on this webinar. And I just want to name that that like is a pattern, and I noticed that in my people to sort of like stay on the sidelines, and then the burden, and I think there are good reasons to like for me to not want to like take up space and talk a lot, but also then the burden of like visible resistance in articulating these things falls to poor and working class people, to women and trans folks and people of color. So I'm leaning into sharing and being vulnerable, even though it's not a thing I particularly enjoy, but I really care about, and sharing my experiences to strengthen movements. So that's part of why I'm here, and part of why I got involved in resource generation, and part of how I think resource generation has pushed me to lead more around these types of issues. So I'm grateful for that. And I think about the Kavanaugh hearing, just want to share that, I just want to share some feelings. I felt a lot of rage throughout that time. I have a lot of survivors in my life, and so that is a primary emotion I feel, and a lot of grief and powerlessness, just sort of like, fuck, my people are like doing this again, and like a feeling of shame and powerlessness around that. I'm not knowing how to shift that. So I'll leave it there. I'll pass to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Adam. So let's do another quick group chat. Just want to give folks a chance to respond to the question that we just asked both our panelists. What stood out to you about the Kavanaugh hearing and Ford testimony? And this could just be sort of like top of mind, or a feeling that came up for you. And invite folks to be self-responsive about level of depth or sharing that you want to do. So the question again is, what stood out to you about the Kavanaugh hearing and Ford testimony? Whiteness was one answer. The sense of entitlement and feeling that this was a given for Kavanaugh, and the weird dynamics at Georgetown Prep. How predictable it was. What stood out to me was the openness with which Kavanaugh demanded his privilege, as wealthy people were taught to code and hide, and it does seem like a sign of the times that he was openly entitled. How he was able to respond to fear versus Dr. Ford. The entitlement on parade, and how white men can yell and scream and cry and be rewarded and lauded, whereas a woman, especially a woman of color, would be taken down for the same behavior. Thank you all for those insights and honest reflections. I really appreciate reading them, and feel free to keep chatting and reading other folks' chats. So I'm going to share just a few framing pieces about intersectionality and why we need to be talking about class and race when we're talking about gender. And our fabulous Joy from Third Wave Fund was going to be leading this section. So I'm going to be sharing some things that are actually from Third Wave Fund's framework in her absence. So first, to just share a little bit about what Third Wave Fund is. So Third Wave Fund is a gender justice funder and has been around for the past 20 years. So is basically as old as resource generation, a little older. and supports revolutionary youth-led activism across the United States, and particularly focuses on organizing that's led by young women, queer, and trans people of color, and folks from working class and poor communities. And I'll say we because I'm a board member of Third Wave, so wearing multiple hats on this call. We really believe in long-term funding and funding organizations that may have never received a grant before, or may have very small budgets. And that's a belief based on how philanthropy is set up. So the amount of philanthropic dollars that go to social justice organizing is below 3% of all philanthropic dollars, and a tiny, tiny percentage of that goes to women, queer, and trans people of color-led organizing. And we know that communities that are most directly impacted by the issues that they're seeking to change are the folks who are best equipped to come up with solutions, and really systemic solutions to address those problems. And that if we center the folks who are most directly impacted, that's going to be the fastest route to make the greatest change that are going to impact all of our lives. So the way that Third Wave defines gender justice, which is what we'll be using in terms of thinking about gender justice together this evening, is that gender justice is a movement to end patriarchy, transphobia, and homophobia, and to create a world free from misogyny. And as gender justice activists, we recognize that gender oppression is tied to classism, racism, ageism, and ableism, and gender justice can only be truly achieved when all forms of oppression cease to exist. And we believe that funding gender justice movements is incredibly important as one tool and way to support gender justice movements, and especially as communities and institutions and people and families who have access to wealth and class privilege, funding gender justice is one really key role we can play, along with organizing and a whole bunch of stuff that we'll be talking a little bit more about later. And we're also defining gender justice movements as multi-issue, because gender is connected to all aspects of our lives, as community-led, and as feminist, queer, and trans unapologetically. The other pieces I'll share about gender justice is that I think that term is most commonly and easily associated with movements like reproductive justice, women's rights and liberation, trans and queer liberation, and anti-violence. And it also, when we're thinking with a really strong race and class lens, it also includes really everything, but including immigrant rights, racial justice, economic justice, health justice, education justice. So to give a quick example, if we're thinking about economic justice with a gender frame, some of the reasons that gender is central to creating economic justice. So one is that Black women are most likely to work for poverty level wages. Our eroded welfare system harms parents and domestic violence survivors. There's rampant employment discrimination against queer and trans people. Sex work is criminalized. The gender wage gap is there for everybody and is incredibly high for women of color. So those are just a few reasons that economic justice and gender justice are inextricably linked. So we're going to shift into some storytelling, and our goal with this is to help start to draw out and lift up examples of what attending elite institutions does to those of us who go through those institutions and how it shapes us. So Adam Roberts is going to do some sharing, and I've asked him if he can tell us a bit about his experience attending prep school at an Ivy League university, specifically around what messages those institutions gave you, Adam, and how that's informed how you think about the work you do today and your path.
Great. Okay. Well, let's see. So I shared earlier, I grew up in Newport, Rhode Island, and so so I went to private schools, basically starting kindergarten, which I think some other folks shared. So grew up in a very like insular culture, within Newport. Newport is like famous for its mansions, so I was like really adjacent to a lot of like very high visible wealth from a young age, and did a lot of like comparing. I think my dad comes from multiple generations of owning class Protestant family. My mom comes from a different class background actually, so did some comparing to these like the beach club we belonged to and the mansions that were down the street from me, and was like, oh, I'm not that rich, you know, compared to these other people I'm around always. And so I think becoming involved in resource generation and many other experiences in my life have like broken that privilege bubble. But I think that was one big part, is I was very unaware of a lot of the like universes that were outside the very insular and particular universe that I grew up in. That universe looked like blazers and pearls and salmon, Nantucket red colors. It looked like lacrosse sticks. I actually played lacrosse and was a varsity lacrosse player. And if you've watched like Harry Potter, that's like pretty much what the dining hall in my high school looked like. And I think, yeah, I wanted to, we were talking about in prep for this call, there were, before I talk about all the really harmful aspects of those cultures, there were, I think, really beautiful and supportive aspects for me, at least, and which included like really wonderful teachers, like a real intense, tight-knit culture, which I think you can see Brett Kavanaugh like also sort of benefiting from in this way, where there's such closeness that then also when put together with entitlement means like, oh, we can do anything, we can get away with anything, and so that is buoying, like that privilege feels like buoying, and so I think there were, you know, being part of a community and a lot of like a really strong community was a supportive thing in some ways, and then was alienating all these ways, because the things that gave you power in that community were the amount of wealth you had, whether you were part of like the alpha male crowd. So I had this experience of simultaneously passing in that culture and also feeling like it was really fucked up and being an outsider of it. So I'll name the school I went to because that feels relevant. St. George's School. It was in the news a couple years ago for a series of sexual abuse scandals that came to light from the 70s and 80s, and also was where Billy Bush attended. So if the moment of Trump being captured on camera saying "grab him by the pussy" was said to Billy Bush, who was a graduate at my school, and that was like really familiar to me as a kind of like boys talk in a lacrosse locker room. So, and one of the things that was like really alienating about playing lacrosse, and yeah, I think other messages I received, that boys will be boys thing, that like it was okay to objectify women in those cultures, that the richer you are, kind of the more power you have, and that's something to aspire to, and that also if you just sort of stay in that lane, and this like privileged culture will take care of you. So like if I just go along with the flow and don't challenge anything, then I'll be taken care of. And that's sort of like, it's this weird mix of messaging that like everyone here is so exceptional, but also you sort of can be utterly not exceptional and just like keep doing, like just stay in the flow, and you will be given all these opportunities and you deserve all these opportunities. Which included for me, like, you know, graduating, going to an Ivy League school. And so, yeah, that's some stuff that comes up for me. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Adam. Really appreciate you sharing honestly. So we want to hear from the group. The question for you all is, if you attended an elite institution, what messages did you receive from those colleges or private schools? And if you didn't attend one, what messages did you receive about those institutions? And I'll put that question in the chat. So again, if you attended an elite institution, what messages did you receive from those institutions? And if you didn't attend one, what messages did you receive about institutions like colleges or private schools? Someone shared, thanks for sharing, I went to Harvard, and they pump your ego. I'm always told Harvard students are going to change the world. Hard not to think of that as Harvard equals money. If you have wealth, money matters more than accountability of predators. We were taught a lot about charity, but nothing about equity. A +1 on that, charity, not justice. That the connections made in college would help us and give us access throughout the rest of our lives. I definitely got that one too. Definitely the message that everyone is exceptional and we are the future leaders, especially at Stanford, definitely resonate with the idea that we just stay in our lane and things will naturally turn out great. The wealthiest people will never be held accountable for being predators, violent, or oppressive. Alcohol consumption was an expectation. As an immigrant, I was often made to feel different, especially in grade school. High school hammered home assumptions about what success looks like that I'm still unlearning. Thank you all. Really appreciate these honest reflections. That I'd be a good leader, that it would be safer not to call out white men for violence. Thank you all so much, and feel free to keep sharing as these come up. So I'm going to turn to Adam Howard to share with us about a few questions. So I asked Adam to prep to share with us about the prompts. How do class and gender intersect at elite institutions like colleges and private schools? And what have you learned in your research about how elite institutions shape students to uphold oppressive systems?
Before I answer that, thank you all so much for sharing it. I mean, a lot of what I research and have discovered are these messages that you're sharing right now about kind of what you've taken away, especially things like charity over justice. And that relates to an earlier point that part of what these institutions try to do is to kind of make you kind of project this kind of goodness so that you don't pay attention to other stuff they're doing that kind of perpetuates injustices. So thank you for sharing all of those things about hardworking. I'm looking at that charity, the balance that's associated with it. So one of the things that I have really kind of been interested in part of how I've tried to understand the culture of elite schools through my research is what lessons students are being taught and what the school claims to be teaching students, about service, about, responsibility and character and all of these other wonderful things that we find in mission statements, that we find in official curriculum and all of that. I mean, and I don't want to be too critical, I want to recognize that, there are some efforts being made to teach those more positive kind of lessons about, who students are and others and the world around them and so forth. But what I have focused on are these other kinds of lessons that students learn that reinforce privileged ways of knowing and doing. And these lessons, what I've discovered in my research, end up being the ones that are most influential for how students come to form how they understand themselves. So no matter how many positive lessons we have, these negative ones, and I'll give a couple of examples that I've learned. They end up being the ones that stick with us. So one of the main lessons that elite schools that I've studied and have taught at teach students that hierarchies that are not only natural, but they're necessary. That you learn that in every situation there is a winner and there is a loser, and in every interaction situation that I go into. And so hierarchies are understood, then come to understand that they enable or propel people to success. And it's important to acknowledge when we think about success that way, then that success always comes at the expense of others. And so we go into every situation, there's a winner, there's a loser, I'm going to be a winner. And so the other lessons that go along with that, I'll win at all costs. So if I learn that these situations, require a winner and a loser, and I need to be a winner, then I'm going to win no matter what. And so that's why, for example, one study that came out, not my own, that at elite schools, about 96, I forget the exact, you get it. It's like a lot of students have cheated in the past year. And part of that is that kind of need to be successful and these kind of win at all costs. So one of the things I've looked at is like, well, where are these lessons being taught in elite schools? And that hierarchies are natural, that they're necessary, that we need to win at all costs, and some of the other kinds of things. And one of the things I've discovered is that it's reinforced, these privilege lessons are reinforced in about every aspect of students' educational experiences, from the curriculum, from what happens in the classrooms, the interactions, involvement in extracurricular activities, things like being on sports teams, social events, and rituals. And I've paid a lot of attention to rituals. I find them incredibly important kind of mechanisms for transmitting kind of these, not only your history of your institution, but expectations for what you're supposed to act like. So rituals in particular are effective in transmitting and reinforcing unspoken cultural expectations, behaviors, norms, values that cultivate privilege as a collective identity and further impose hierarchies. And some of these rituals aren't very public, even though everyone within elite schools often know about them. And my own institution, I'm probably going to get in trouble saying this, I don't care. We have underground fraternities. They're miserable, in what happens, in what they inflict on our culture at my liberal arts college. And everyone knows who's in the underground fraternities. Everyone knows what they do, but suddenly they're supposed to be hidden in secret. But when these rituals and these secret parts of of these cultures become public, like when things happen in the news, at different schools, like the screw dance at a St. Paul's school in 2014, or other things, last chance dances, and the list goes on. Rarely are they made public, but when they do, we learn what these rituals are truly about, and they're about celebrating male sexual conquest. And what I find is that all of these things that are being reinforced, this privilege as identity, it just contradicts what the schools claim to be about, and things like they compassion and so forth. But that's where my hope is also, and why I continue to research this, because if institutions say that they're really committed to these things, then I'm hopeful that we can move towards those more positive interactions and more positive kind of cultural kind of norms and expectations and all of that. If you say that you have that commitment, let's sort out the contradictions, and let's begin to teach the kinds of lessons to students that actually reinforce those more positive interactions. I'm hopeful. I have to have hope. Paulo Freire says that hope is necessary to do the kind of critical work that we're doing. So it may look like very frustrating to kind of go against a culture that perpetuates very unhealthy interactions with others, and hypermasculinity, heteronormative kind of norms and so on. But I do think it's possible to have alternative lessons that reinforce things that would disrupt or interrupt privileged ways of knowing and doing.
Thank you so much, Adam. Great. So we are going to turn to hearing from some of the Resource Generation members who are currently in college, who are offering to share some with us. And Adam Roberts, I'm not sure what order folks want to go in, so will you introduce people in the order that makes sense?
Yes, I am going to pass it to Harshita first.
And just to do, sorry, Harshita, one second, just to do a slight intro, we asked folks to share a little bit about who they are, and how the culture of being currently in these institutions is shaping folks' experiences, and also a little bit about taking action.
Cool. Hi, my name's Harshita. I take they, them, theirs, or she, her, hers pronouns. I'm currently at Harvard. I'm in my third year here. I want to talk a little bit about what we call money stories, or how I got here, and the story of money and class and wealth and capitalism. And then just talk a little bit about what it's like to be like an immigrant, a queer woman of color in these spaces. So I immigrated to the US 6 years ago. I come from a very well-educated family in India. Everyone on my grandparents' down has been educated. There are PhDs and professors in my family. Wealth accumulation in India isn't as extreme as it is in the US, but we were certainly in the 1%. And I think that I grew up my whole life being told I was really smart. I had really smart parents. My dad was an engineer. I always knew I would have a cool profession. I decided when I was in 5th grade I wanted to be an engineer. And I really think that like the cultural influences that I had growing up and the messages that I was given are really critical and a huge part of how I've been so successful and got into Harvard and all that stuff. I had a mom who spoke great English, had an amazing vocabulary, could stay at home because my dad's US salary at an engineering company supported our family. So my mom would read to me from like the day that I could like look at a book, and probably even before I was applied with books growing up. English was always my best subject. And yeah, we moved to the US when I was 14 for my dad to kind of for career reasons. And I think that it's really important to highlight that my dad was able to immigrate to the US. And the reason that I'm a citizen today is because of immigration pipelines that really privilege folks who already have class and educational access in their country of origin, which in India is overwhelmingly like caste and class privilege. And yeah, I think that a lot of what I've been thinking about recently is the conditional ways in which class privilege is afforded, specifically to Asian Americans and to immigrants, on a kind of like terms and conditions basis. And it's really the model minority myth kind of like hands you class privilege in exchange for silence and political complicity, and in a way that can be really invisibilizing. And yeah, so I came out of kind of like the Silicon Valley 90% Asian American context, dropped into Harvard, which is really not an institution built for people like me. People like me are supposed to work engineering jobs, be happy, be silent. When I come here and I start taking women, gender, and sexuality studies classes, I start doing BGLTQ advocacy, and learning how hard it really is for like women of color and queer women and immigrants to have a voice in places like this and to know how to navigate places like this. My parents had technical education. But my mom is like, what the hell do you do when you go to the library? Like, like, do you read all the books? You can't read that many books. So it's been interesting for me to navigate that. But at the same time, I think what it's really emphasized is my class privilege will not protect me and buffer me from the challenges that people of color and queer people in this country face. And it's really the labor of like Black, trans, poor women that has afforded me the liberation that I have today as a queer person. And it's only when Black, poor, disabled, trans people are liberated that all of us will be. And so I think that this class privilege that white supremacy has given me is like mine to leverage, and for me to say like, I'm not going to be your model minority and I'm going to give this money away, and I'm going to use this class access that I have been given and my Harvard in to dismantle the structures that like oppress us and keep us in these positions. And so I started getting involved with resource generation in the spring, went to Making Money Make Change, which is the annual conference, a little bit like 2 weeks ago, actually. I'm still recovering, and have pledged for now to give about 15% of what I'm making just with my tech intern salary every summer. I make like $30K a year, and then hopefully I'm planning to ramp up my income giving by the time I've graduated, paid off my student loans. So I do have a little bit of student loans and financial aid. I come from an upper class family, so about like the 91, 92nd percentile rather than an owning class family. But I still think that like upper class people, even though we're socialized to say, but they have so much more, have a role to play in this work. Yeah, I just wanted to end by saying like, I'm really happy to talk more with folks. I think that this work can be really confusing and isolating if you have a lot of like complicated intersections of identity, and it's really easy to back out of it and say like, this isn't like clear cut for me the way it can be for other people. I guess it's not clear cut for anyone, but yeah, feel free to find me on Facebook, LinkedIn, I don't know, like message me privately here and I'll give you my contact information. I would love to talk more. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Harshita. I'm going to pass it to our next speaker, who is Meg.
Hi, everyone. I'm Meg. I use she, her. I have been a member of RG for almost a year now. I started a chapter with a friend at Yale, where I go to school, in, I guess, the spring. So basically, I've grown up with a lot of wealth. My parents are real estate developers in Hartford, Connecticut. I've been going to private school since literally kindergarten. And my private schooling has enabled me to, and my parents' wealth and class privilege has enabled me to have a career as a child actor prior to going to college. So I was actually able to like accumulate wealth on my own, independent of my parents. And so yeah, I'm accountable for both of these, I don't know, reserves of wealth. And I went to Choate Rosemary Hall, a prep school in Connecticut where JFK attended, and like some people literally call it a feeder school for Yale. I was one of 5 people in my grade who went to Yale, and that was like kind of average to low for a year. Like sometimes, my school sent like 8 people in a year to Yale. So it was kind of no surprise that I went to Yale. Child acting was also a good gimmick to get me in as well, I think. And so I think my experience of being at private school, like similarly to Adam, a lot of parts of it were really enjoyable. My life in a dorm like allowed me to like break free of my parents and learn things that I wouldn't have learned at home in my like very conservative, white, wealthy environment. And it was, yes, like conservative and wealthy, but less white than I'd previously experienced. And going to school like Yale had ironically enabled me to like learn about socialism and become an American studies major and learn about colonialism and the harms of capitalism. So I think I've gained a lot from these environments, but I also like learned a lot of really toxic things, like I really learned in high school, or I guess it was reinforced, that I should defer to men. So I kind of like learned to be partner and complicit in violence in a certain way. And I see this in Yale's environment as well, as folks can imagine. So I think that something I'm, learning how to do is remain accountable to people who are in like on a, at a different place in their journey, because it's easy to want to like distance myself from parts of like my identity and my history and things I have believed at different moments. And so trying to remain connected to like all the different steps in that process is part of this journey I'm on. Because there have been moments when, I was hiding my class privilege and kind of coming to terms with how I can like be a whole person and also hold these politics. So that's it for now. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, Meg. And we're going to have time to chat in a second, but feel free to continue to chat things that resonate with you from people that are sharing or questions that you have that come up. And I'm going to pass to Flannery.
Hi, I'm Flannery. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns. My brief money story, specifically the money that comes for college for me, comes from both of my grandmothers, and from one of the grandmothers, a generation skipping trust or dynasty trust, which is like a super creepy way to keep money flowing through your family forever. And that was actually how my dad was able to accumulate the wealth in my lifetime, because the bank matched a loan that allowed him to start a business that he sold 30 years later for like $775 million. And it was like an organic meat business that he started basically from like going to Hampshire and like learning about how to sort of like a theme that draws through my life of like these sort of like hippie, really rich people who kind of go under the radar. So then I went to like a private boarding school that was like a farming and art school that really like actively taught us to hide our class privilege, was like just totally fed to us. And then I went to RISD, where I, from going to a kind of art school and like having an art family, like an aunt was like, you should let Flannery in. And I don't know what affected what, but so then I was like involved in, both of my sisters were at Brown. Like all of this is totally normalized to me because like my mom went to Harvard, my dad went to Hampshire. It was never kind of a question for us. And at RISD, I really encountered like, even though I've been in these like predominantly like the cis men are like the minority of the communities that I've been a part of, like they've always taken up the most space, and always like the wealthiest cis guys that are like the most violent have always just like skated by and gotten away with the most blatant things, and everyone else gets kicked out for tiny things. So, and I was like organizing with Black artists and designers and doing all this stuff, totally hiding my class privilege. And actually kind of left RISD because of the really like toxic, violent environment of like wealthy, like famous parents' kids. And went to Bennington, and I'm like started with resource generation. I went to Making Money Make Change conference, like totally blew my mind. I ended up like working with my family a lot, and we give like a lot more away, not enough. But I started a chapter at Bennington, and kind of like the ways that this like art, social capital, cultural capital, and class privilege have been able to allow me to like move through all different social groups has allowed me to like organize some of the guys that I have like seen come up in my life in ways that I haven't really been able to before, trying to figure out how to navigate that a bit. Yeah, I guess that's all.
Thank you three so much for sharing so honestly and beautifully about your stories. I'm wondering if this is an on-the-fly question. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what it's been like to try to organize other young people with wealth in the institutions that you're in. Like, what's worked about that? What's been challenging? What have people's reactions been?
For me, it started off really slow. Like people kind of would just like look right through me and walk away. And that still totally happens. But there's this culture, I think that sort of specifically happens in these types of like liberal arts colleges, is like hiding class privilege makes it really, really difficult for people to engage at all. And like the people who I've had the most success with are people who are already in social justice movements, who are hiding their class privilege. Like we just got the first cis guy to show up to our praxis group. I've been doing this for like a year. But it's like now that there's more momentum, like more people know about it and can't hide as easily.
I can chime in super quickly. I think that one of the challenging parts of this work is that a lot of the time class and wealth can show up in interesting intersections very differently and can affect people's immediate access to wealth, immediate ability to give away. And I think that for everyone, an action plan looks very different in terms of whether that looks like talking to wealthy people that they have access to because of their class networks, whether that looks like giving away the money that they currently have access to, whether that looks like money that they're earning through high-wage jobs that they've been essentially pipelined for through their class access, whether it's their parents' money, if they're going to inherit later, all of these complicated questions. And so I think that a lot of it has just been the nitty-gritties of thinking through how individual people have different ways that they can leverage their class access and how specialized it is and specific it can be, and how you really need to like think through everybody's abilities, where they're at, their strengths. Something I'm personally working on is fundraising abilities, so my ability to talk to wealthy people I have access to and get them on board with this, and that's something I'm trying to build a community around so that we can practice those sorts of like challenging conversations and become better at that sort of stuff. Yeah, thanks for the question, Sarah.
Yeah, I think was it challenges and rewarding things, or
yeah, like how's it going?
It's going, yeah. We had our first cis dude show up at our last praxis group, so that's huge. And we actually have another one committed to coming this weekend, so that I'm pumped. I think we have like a really like lovely committed group of people, and I'm really excited to learn with them. It's I think something that's come up as a challenge is trying to kind of imagine how the group can serve people's needs that are very different. We're not a large enough group to develop two different ones that have different focuses, but there's definitely like a contingent that's a lot more engaged in social justice work, and then there's some people who are like very new to this kind of work and have more questions about how to even begin to like feel care in this way, and I think that it's actually really important that we're all in a room together, but I think that's part of the challenge and the stickiness of the work is like how do we relate it to these different stages of this kind of work and thinking. And yeah, that's vague, but
thank you all so much for sharing. And thank you for the work you're doing. It's really a big deal. And I know from also starting this organizing when I was on a college campus that it's not an easy environment to be forwarding this work for a lot of different reasons. So it's such a big deal. I'm just really grateful to you all for what you're doing. Okay, we're going to do another group chat question. And that question is, just finding it. So what is action that you long to take in the networks or spaces that you're connected to that are elite and class privileged? So you could also share actions that you are taking, but I know listening to everybody, it makes me get excited about what are even more things that I could think about or do. So actions you long to take in these networks or spaces. And again, inviting folks from any class background to share. And these can be ideas and brainstorms. We can resist any elite training any of us have by not needing to be perfect. Awesome. So organizing Phillips Academy alumni. Yeah. Getting college students to give together and to commit to giving away all their intergenerational inherited wealth. Whoop, whoop. That's awesome. We're trying to organize a men's group, and it's been really hard. I've completely distanced myself from the elite institutions I've attended because the experiences were pretty painful. I have enough distance now, however, that I'd love ideas about how alumni can engage in a positive way. I buy all the books for adults for the New Orleans Public Library. Attempting to make our collection reflect our community is impossible, but a goal I strive for. I want to completely change the college admission system, standardize testing so that they aren't graded on a curve, remove the idea of competition and hierarchy. Moving my money from Bank of America to a more socially conscious community invested bank or credit union. Talking to friends with wealth who should know about RG, and using networks from private high schools to bring more folks into RG. Love it. Organizing alumni to change our college's behavior around Title IX and divestment. Awesome. Fantastic. Keep dreaming and brainstorming and adding more stuff. And Harshita wanted to share one more thing. So go for it.
Yeah, just a small addition to what I think the challenge is. I think RG right now skews a little bit inheritance heavy, and I think that wealth and class looks really, really different in America based on where you're located, what cost of living is like, particularly for people of color and immigrants. And so I think a really big part of it is when you go to an institution like Harvard, where 50% of students, this is like factually true, 50% of students come from the top 10%.
Uh-oh. Harshita, I think we're losing you, tragically. Are other people losing her?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe, oh, hi, you're back. Do you mind just summarizing we lost you for maybe 20 seconds. Do you want to just, you were saying inheritors versus other kinds of wealth.
Yeah, okay. Oh, bummer. Okay. Yeah, I think one of the hardest parts, like Harvard is a school that 50% of the students at Harvard come from the top 10% of the national like wealth distribution, and that's a crazy number, but I think it causes people to look around and not necessarily see their class privilege and see that their class privilege can look different than like in.
All right. Okay, well, let's keep moving. We're having some tech issues, but I'll ask Harshita if they can text or chat into the chat the rest of their thoughts. Harshita, will you chat us the rest of your thoughts? We keep losing you. Awesome. Okay, great. I am going to pass to Adam Roberts to share more about where we go from here in terms of taking action.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. And I'm seeing in a lot of people's longings, like more possibilities than I think I have here. So I'm just really grateful to everyone for like being on a webinar late at night for some of us and like being really, really participating and offering your full selves and thinking. So feeling excited and inspired, and we'll offer a few other things in terms of action. One is, I just want to name something we're doing a lot of here and not just skip over it, which in resource generation, we do a lot of telling stories, naming actual numbers around wealth, like talking about class really explicitly. I think this maybe been shared a little bit why we do that, but I just want to make a connection. That is a point of action, and that's also how we bring people into movement and disrupt like common and shared narratives. So I think actually just talking about this shit with people in our lives, family, friends, like honestly and authentically and vulnerably does like open up space and creates possibilities for organizing. So I just want to encourage people to keep doing that, and that RG can be a landing place for support. Because sometimes that can be hard too. And also just like the whole, I mean, silence protects the owning class. Silence about like numbers, like allows, you know, if I like don't share the fact that I have access to $1 million, then like I'm not accountable around it, right? So I think a similar thing in thinking about the Kavanaugh hearings and just the way silence like protects perpetrators from accountability. Yeah, keeps these like abusive cycles operative. So just yeah, really feeling that tie and like want to be doing our part as wealthy folks in breaking silence around how wealth is accumulated, and then yeah, how we can be stepping into action. So that was a piece. The other piece that resonated, like folks who were like, the last place I want to go like do organizing or like even just like enter back into is like my prep school or the college I went to, because of like real trauma that happens in those spaces. So I just want to honor that. Yeah, I think there's a call for us in resource generation. And I know I feel as a man and a white man to like go and get my people, and just know that like, I think I just want to name that can be hard too, and that there's a lot of trauma that lives there, and it can be scary, and that, yeah, I think RG, again, I hope we can be a landing place for folks to get support around that. And so yeah, and I just share that, like, I can't imagine having some of these conversations and with like the guy who went on to work for Paul Ryan in my school or whatever, right? But thinking about who is the people, who are other disaffected folks from your schools, and how can we be like banding together and forming community and building power, and doing that with poor and working class led organizations. And that's part of what RG is about. And yeah, and then let's see. I think one just point before I share like a couple concrete calls to action. I just think like it feels really clear to me that none of these, as a wealthy white man, that none of the systems currently in power like are working for me and like are hurting a lot of people I love. And I just want to name that, and I believe that that is true. Like I see the sort of like walking zombies that are a lot of like white men and particularly class privileged white men, and like how rigid like we have to hold ourselves and be in that training, and believe there's a stake for us too in it, and just want to lift that up, because it is really easy to feel hopeless about that and like see, you know, people as zombies. And yeah, I believe we can transform and I hold on to that. And that is really like, and that is really work I want to call white men into, and owning class white men into in particular, to like to train each other up on holding more emotional space for each other, so that the damage and work of that doesn't fall to other people. And know that if you weren't trained in that, like I wasn't trained in a lot of it either. And that, yeah, just that we don't have to do it alone, and we can rely on each other and be vulnerable with each other, and that's important. Concrete calls to action: get involved with resource generation. If you're a young person with wealth, ages 18 to 35, we really want you and need you in this movement. We are doing movement building work, and we need as many people as we can get. And if you are not a young person with wealth, or poor working class or above 35, we really rely on partnering with across class to do our work. So we need your insight also, and really value that. Want to encourage folks to move resources to gender justice organizations led by people most impacted. So in the gender justice in the intersectional way that Sarah talked about. So I'm going to call out two amazing organizations. Maybe someone can chat them or links to them in the chat. Groundswell Fund and Third Wave Fund, who is going to be here, one of our presenters. Third Wave Fund in particular is just hiring two new amazing co-directors, and as a moment of transition, and are doing a fundraising campaign. I just doubled my annual pledge to them. I'm really excited to support their leadership. So encourage people to look at Third Wave and Groundswell, which is doing really amazing, also political and electoral funding work too. So really amazing organizations, and as wealthy folks, we can be redistributing wealth into their hands. And yeah, I think finally, just if you are on this call and work at an elite institution and want to partner with RG, whether you're like at a college or a high school, and thinking about like you're working with young people with wealth, we also really want to partner with you and learn from you, and value your insight. So those are some concrete calls to action, and I'm going to pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Adam. So to share a few more pieces around action, one thing I was struck by Dr. Ford's testimony was, I think, referencing something someone had said earlier, I, as another owning class white woman, saw myself in her and felt led by her in the ways that she was breaking the pact of silence that she was supposed to keep as a white woman, and defecting from allegiance to what Kavanaugh and his fellow men in power are trying to keep growing. And then I think that's a lot of what we're doing at Resource Generation is trying to create another path and walking that other path and trying to bring more and more people onto that together. So to say just a little bit more about, in particular, wealth redistribution, which is a big part of what we are up to at Resource Generation, and a lot of folks have spoken beautifully to. So we, the reason that we're lifting up Third Wave Fund and Groundswell Fund, and I'll send a list afterwards of a number of other gender justice funders. So these particular organizations are really awesome wealth redistribution vehicles. So I know that given where I come from, my identities, and also just being a single human in the world, I'm not actually going to be the expert or know tons about where amazing women of color, queer and trans people of color led organizing is happening, or what is happening around the country. So organizations like Groundswell and Third Wave are experts in gender justice movements and have connections to organizations around the country, and are places where those organizations can also go and build relationship and apply for and receive grants. And they're great places for folks like me who have wealth and class privilege and who can fundraise my family to give money to, that then moves that money to organizations around the country that are working for things that I'm also working for in my own local context. So that's why, in particular, we're lifting those organizations up when we're thinking about giving, and also really encourage folks to be giving, fundraising to organizations that you know about that are also led by communities most impacted, that are on your radar and in your community. And again, we'll send out more information about those various organizations. And as well as alongside funding, part of what we believe at RG is that it's incredibly important for us to be putting our bodies and hearts on the line, and organizing, joining in activist efforts, and really walking with and alongside communities who are leading the way to liberation. So that is, I think, the conclusion of our time together. We are so excited to have shared this time with all of you. And we want to do one last group chat and ask folks, what are you taking away from this webinar? What's on your heart or in your mind as you're leaving this evening together? So again, that question is, what are you taking away from this conversation, and what's on your heart or mind? I feel like something I've felt for a long time has been named, and I'm grateful to all of you for that. That my experience doesn't exist in isolation. More courage not to shy away from engaging with this part of my life. Feels so good, healing, and hopeful to be virtually with other people who see the bullshit behind elite private institutions and want to work together to address it. We're not alone and can get support with this work. Thank you for the information and encouragement. We're stronger in numbers. The numbers tonight have me smiling. Seeing new folks fills me with hope, with the hope Adam identified as so necessary to this work. Feeling inspired and grateful to have community organizing within elite institutions like mine and from outside. Feeling recommitted to this work. I love these. In particular, personal wealth redistribution, which I find easy to turn off in my brain for long periods of time. Encouraged that my experiences are more shared than I realized. Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining. We will send out a few materials after this call, and just really, really grateful to be in community with all of you. Have a good evening, everybody. Yeah, and everybody who presented, if you want to stay on, we can do like a quick little debrief check-in. We'll just wait for folks to head out. Yeah, Adam Howard, stay with us. I saw your chat.
And Sarah, maybe we could stop recording here.
Oh yeah.